I consider the Pennsylvania Railroad T1 one of, if not the most beautiful locomotive of all time. As such, it was one of my earliest Lego scale models, and perhaps not the best. I built the first version in 2014, basically 10 years ago, when 9-volt use was much higher and part selection was much smaller. While this iteration did utilize the new parts of the time, such as Big Bend bricks, number 11 wheels, and various curved slopes, it still had a fairly plain exterior and no internal drivetrain. I intended to push it with an external power car, though I did design and even test a tender with a Power Functions drivetrain. The two major revisions in maybe 2018 and 2019 were more or less entirely mechanical. Version 2 reduced the friction in the articulated locomotive chassis, and version 3 finally brought a tender with a more usable PF drivetrain. The low efficiency and mediocre performance of this setup became more apparent as I gained more experience in building and running more models. And last year, I finally decided to take another crack at the T1. Version 4 is a complete internal and external redesign with even more changes than my 5AT and T18 rebuilds. Thanks to a better reference model and to a plethora of new parts released in the past 10 years, especially one-by-one parts from brackets to tiles, I could add a lot more detail to the locomotive, from the firebox greebles to the cab windows. I also moved the entire body back one stud, which seemed to better match the profile of the prototype. I found less to improve on the tender, keeping the same paneled skirts and the same curved cowling profile. I inset the deck like the one on the Q2 tender, but the transition to the streamlining over the bunker still feels a little rough. Inside, I added brick-built coal, and in front, I added some limited greebling. I used the same wheel axle arrangement as before in order to maintain the same amount of skirting. Perhaps most importantly, I moved the drivetrain from the tender to the locomotive. As in the 5AT and then the Q2, I used L motors and number 11 drivers with no reduction. Despite having powered wheels, the chassis articulation remains unchanged, with a full pilot bogie in the front, two blind flange bogies following, and a trailing bogie with a sliding axle. I subsequently did not have any additional clearance to change the original cylinder and piston design. Recall that the Q2 had a thing where the more lightly loaded motor would spin faster than the more heavily loaded motor. In that model, I did not have enough space between the two power bogies to address the issue. But in the T1, I can install a CV joint to connect the front and rear drivers. I can't use a universal joint because I need a sliding element to match the geometry of the expansion joint, keeping the rear drivers aligned. With the mass centered close to the fourth driver, I wanted to keep the weight on the powered wheels and off of the unpowered rear axles. The last truck connects with a tow ball, which allows it to pivot up and down within the constraint of the track below and the plate above. A floating sliding leading axle keeps all the remaining weight on the trailing axle to discourage the bogie from derailing when pushing in reverse. The 840-gram locomotive can pull about 220 grams without tires, almost enough to consistently break magnets. It comes close to the Q2 in weight and in traction, despite the more uneven weight distribution. Furthermore, the T1 seems to run a little slower. On an R104 circle, it only managed 58 centimeters per second, while the Q1 managed 68 centimeters per second. This speed reduction could come from additional drivetrain friction caused by joining the bogies, or perhaps just from erratic performance from the knockoff L motors. Not entirely intentionally, the operational ergonomics turned out really well. The unstudded cab roof comes off to access the power button. The two-studded rear cab comes off to access the battery. The boiler top comes off to reveal the motors. Both the wiring runs from the motors to the receiver and from the receiver to the battery have a decent amount of space and require few bends. Unfortunately, the motors themselves don't come out easily. Furthermore, I can lever the body off the chassis by pushing on the running board supports, which actually stay with the chassis. The front articulation point needs more studs of connection since the weight of the body concentrates in the rear. The running boards themselves hold the two bogies together such that I can roll the chassis and inspect the articulation without the body connected. After all that, the model still runs on R40 geometry, though I still would not recommend it. I initially did not plan on this, but since I managed to use the original articulation with the same cylinder and piston design, R40 compatibility basically came for free. That being said, it still doesn't like reversing into the infamous switch after curve, though not quite in the same way as before. Finally, I tightened the apparent gap between the locomotive and the tender by adding some baffling to the rear of the cab and changing the geometry of the drawbar. I can reduce the spacing by a perhaps practically imperceptible half a stud for R104. Adjusting this distance always requires a bunch of trial and error because I don't have a good way to simulate the required articulation in CAD. Anyway, I'm really happy with almost everything in this revision, though maybe the loco more than the tender. But a complicated build like this is perhaps never done. I will look into instructions once I can discover and fix any bugs. On that note, this is the end of the video. Please consider subscribing if you like what we do, and have a nice day.